All right, guys, here we go. Chapter 15 for Crim 1, Juvenile Justice. You all know that I was I was a probation officer and I worked with juveniles, so this is something that I'm pretty familiar with, and I was lucky enough to get to work with kids most of my career. Back in the olden days, long time ago, children and adults were treated the same. Okay? So if you were a kid and you were 13 and you got arrested for stealing something, you were going to jail with all the adult men and women, and your court proceedings were basically exactly the same, and juveniles were treated just like little adults. There was a defense called that infancy defense, and this is actually something that's still used today, meaning you're too young to really understand, to form the mens rea in order to commit a crime. Young children were put into basically slavery. They were placed in homes. During the Industrial Revolution, they were forced to work. Now, we're talking about things like orphanages, and we're talking about like over 100 years ago when this kind of stuff was going on. So don't think that like in my lifetime this was happening, because it was a long time ago. The Quakers came to the United States, and they were a religious group that believed that juveniles were different than adults and that they should have been treated differently. So 1899, first juvenile court. Reasons to try juvenile in juvenile court: because they were likely to be abused in jail. Early intervention could help rehabilitate. They didn't really understand what they were doing was wrong, and they didn't have the opportunity to get away from bad families. Parens patriae. This is one of my favorite terms because I have a kind of a slang that I use to describe this, but ultimately, parens patriae was an British concept that came when the King of England basically would step in and act as a parent for children who were unruly. He basically said, your parents aren't taking care of business, they're not raising you the way they should, so I'm going to step in and I'm going to make decisions on their behalf. That still happens today in juvenile court here in the state of California, in the United States. Parens patriae, the judge, steps in and makes decisions on behalf of the child because the parent isn't making the adequate decisions. My slang for this is the court is your daddy. So, and hopefully you'll never forget that because of my stupid slang. Juvenile delinquency. These are criminal acts that are committed by minors under the age of 18. I know it says 18 or 21 here. In California, under the age of 18. Okay, not 18 and under, not 21 and under the age of 18. Status offense. A status offense is an act that is only illegal because of your age. Okay, so let me give you an example. Me, 40-something-year-old woman, walking down the street at 2 o'clock in the morning. Fresno PD rolls up on me. Is there a problem? No, there's not a problem. I'm an old woman. If I want to walk up and down the streets in the middle of the night, I can. Let's say my 15-year-old daughter, I know she's not 15 anymore, but whatever. My 15-year-old daughter is walking down the street at 2 o'clock in the morning by herself, and Fresno PD rolls up on her. Is that a problem? It is, because she's 15. She can't be out past curfew. But it's only illegal because of her age. Make sense? I hope so. Causes of delinquency. The causes of delinquency are as far and wide as the causes of crime for adults. So, parental supervision, socioeconomic status, the neighborhoods they come from, race, ethnicity, all these things do have impacts on delinquent behavior. Measuring juvenile crime, blah, 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 decreased since 1994. Proportion of black juveniles arrested for violent crime has decreased. Murder rates were the lowest by 2011. We talked about these surveys and stuff early on in this class. So self-reporting data versus National Crime Victimization Survey, but anyways, here's a little chart that tells you about violent crime, and you'll see that spike in the early 1990s. I'm telling you, the crack era was no joke. That is when things went crazy. The crack era, early 90s, right in there. So, and it's now lower than it was in the 80s, in 1980. Well, I shouldn't say now. In 2011 it was. I'm skipping that. Police. Police officers are typically the first ones that are involved when a crime has been committed. Someone reports it to the police, or they actually observe it themselves, and they contact the offender. And sometimes that's an adult, and sometimes it's a juvenile. Juveniles are sometimes treated differently than adults by police. Police officers have a lot of discretion with youth. And, you know, there's good and bad to it. But there is now, of course, a juvenile justice system that we have in the United States. So here we go talk about police discretion. Police officers can warn them. They can handle cases informally. They can arrest them. Consider the attitude and demeanor of the juveniles. This is, for me, a lot of times juveniles get arrested, or people in general get arrested, because they fail the attitude test. If you act like a big jerk to the police, it's fairly likely that they're going to be more likely to arrest you than if you are not being a big jerk. But officers do have a lot of discretion in dealing with juveniles. Police are positive role models to youth. Well, we try to do that. PAL, Fresno has a PAL league, Police Officer Athletic League. I know they did some boxing. I think they had some football stuff. Police school liaison programs. That was what I did. And as a probation officer, they even had me going out to elementary schools, which was, you know, pretty interesting. We were trying to build relationships with youth. D.A.R.E, you probably all remember D.A.R E, Drug Abuse Resistance Education. There's D.A.R E in the classroom. Modern juvenile courts. There's two different types of cases that are heard in the juvenile courts: delinquency or dependency. We know what delinquency is. We know juvenile delinquency is a juvenile who commits crime. Dependency is a juvenile whose parent or guardian is either inappropriate or absent. So, like, I would say dependency is kind of like probation court. I'm sorry. Delinquency is like probation court, and dependency is like CPS court. Blah, blah, blah. Under 18. Under 18 and under 18. This is different ages for what we call a waiver. So, a waiver is when a court decides that a juvenile should be tried as an adult. So, you're going to see in here the age of 14 in California is in here. This is inaccurate. This is as of 2011. It is now 16. So we actually are the oldest. So if you are not at least 16 in California and committed a strikeable offense, you will not be tried as an adult. I think we talked about that with the two boys that were 13 that burnt down the Porterville library. You guys will remember they were both 13, and I think 2 people died as a result of that fire. And we talked about the fact that those boys cannot be tried in adult court because they are under 16. So, anyways, we're talking about at the time the offense was committed. Waiver mechanism to permit juvenile court to waive jurisdiction and let them go to adult court. I'm going to skip that. Direct file. There is an opportunity for the prosecution to file directly into adult court as well. It's a kind of a long story, long drawn out story. It doesn't happen that often. Okay. Functioning juvenile court. They are a little bit more informal than adult courts, but one of the big differences in juvenile and adult court is that only certain people are allowed in the courtroom for juvenile cases. This case in Ray Galt took place in 1967, and this is a case that basically gave juveniles due process rights. Before that, before 1967, juveniles didn't have the same due process rights that adults did in the courtroom, which is kind of a problem. So now, as of 1967, that changed. Yeah, no juries. That's one different thing about them. You'll see this case here. Juveniles are not entitled to juries beyond a reasonable doubt. It's the same. Can't be tried for both at the same time. Other important cases. This one is an important one down here. The death penalty for people younger than 18 for murder is cruel and unusual punishment. This was 2005. So prior to 2005, it was not illegal to put someone who was under 18 at the time the offense was committed to death. So that's, this is important. If you were under 18, the day before my 18th birthday, I went out and shot and killed 50 people, I'm not going to be put to death because of this case. Blah, blah, blah. I'm going to kind of skip through that. Same. Juveniles are held in juvenile hall. You know that. Intake. After a juvenile is arrested, the police report will go straight to the probation department. It does not go to the DA first. It goes straight to probation, and the probation officer decides whether or not to send the police report to the prosecutor. These are some things that could happen. So we've talked about, I hate this word, and information is the actual charging document for adults. In the juvenile world, it's called a petition. And the intake officer, I just said that. Diversion programs, we have a lot of diversion programs for juveniles. And why we have diversion programs for juveniles so that their mistakes that they made when they were under 18 don't stay with them forever. These diversion programs, typically if a juvenile complies with whatever the program is, then their case gets dismissed and sealed as if it never happened. Anyways, so there's teen courts, there are drug courts, behavioral health courts, you name it, and there's a bunch for juveniles as well. And again, there are ways of handling the case informally so that the record doesn't follow them throughout life. Yeah, we don't do a lot of preventative detention anymore because, well, number one, we really don't detain a lot of juveniles at all anymore, but so we don't do that anymore. A lot of. Risk assessments. When a juvenile is placed into custody, there's always going to be a risk assessment done to decide how dangerous that juvenile is upon release to the community, if they get released. Adjudication hearing, that is exactly like a trial. It is exactly like a trial. So if you were to say, if I were to ask a question like, in adult court, it's known as a trial, and in juvenile court, it's known as blank, I would say adjudication. Okay. Disposition. Disposition is exactly the same thing as sentencing. Disposition is sentencing. Juveniles in California, in most cases, are allowed to have their records sealed. Okay, so I'm just going to kind of leave this here so you can, you can pause and read it if you need. Juvenile Corrections, I would say that's basically what I did. I did not work inside a correctional facility, but I was employed in Juvenile Corrections. Rehabilitation is where we are now. Large state-run facilities, this would be CYA or DJJ as we call it now. That's the California Youth. We used to be the California Youth Authority, is now the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation Division of Juvenile Justice. Whew, that's a mouthful. Yeah, juveniles are not, in California, we don't put juveniles in adult prisons. Juveniles can go to group homes. You've probably heard of these before. For example, there's a sex offender who molested his little sister. Instead of locking him up, sometimes the courts will put him into a group home with other sex offenders to keep the little sister safe and to keep him from being locked up and to work on his issues. We do have female juvenile institutions. Probation, again, that's what I did. We talked about probation. Same thing for juveniles as it is for adults. Parole, kind of the same thing. When they get released from DJJ, they go on to parole. We used to have these cool boot camp programs. I might have talked about this in class before, but they have been found to be ineffective, and we don't use them anymore. Or certainly in Fresno, we don't. Ours was closed down in 2009, I believe. I think we already talked about Day Reporting Center. Oh my gosh, we just did it. Done.